Rebecca adjusted the display case in the boutique, smoothing the velvet beneath the rows of diamond bracelets. The store had just opened, and the scent of fresh coffee lingered from the break room. It was a quiet morning until her manager's voice sliced through the air. "Rebecca, my office! Now!" A pit formed in her stomach as she followed him inside. The boutique owner, Mrs. Ellsworth, sat stiffly behind the desk, arms crossed, her face unreadable. Between them, on the polished wood, lay an empty velvet box, the one that had held a $50,000 sapphire bracelet. Rebecca's throat went dry. "You were the last one to handle it," Mrs. Ellsworth said. Rebecca blinked. I don't understand." Her manager folded his arms. "Security footage shows you locking up last night. And now, this morning, it's missing." Panic crept up her spine. She had been careful, meticulous. There was no way. "I didn't take it," she said firmly. Mrs. Ellsworth's gaze darkened. "Then explain where it is." Rebecca opened her mouth, but nothing came out, because she had no idea, and from the way they were looking at her, they had already made up their minds. Rebecca sat in the tiny, windowless back office of the boutique, her hands clenched together in her lap. The store's security guard stood by the door, arms crossed, as if she might make a run for it. Mrs. Ellsworth had already called the police. Her breath came in shallow bursts. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be. "You understand we have no choice," Mrs. Ellsworth said, her voice clipped. "I trusted you, Rebecca. You've worked here for 3 years." Rebecca's stomach twisted. 3 years of early shifts, late nights, and extra hours whenever they needed her. She had loved this job, and now none of it mattered. "I didn't take it," she whispered, but the words felt useless. Her manager sighed. "Then, help us understand why the bracelet disappeared under your watch." Rebecca swallowed hard. She had double-checked the case before leaving last night. She knew the bracelet had been there. Had someone tampered with the security footage? Had she made some mistake? The office door swung open, and a uniformed officer stepped inside. "Rebecca Hayes?" She nodded, her pulse thudding in her ears. "You'll need to come with us." Her vision blurred as they led her through the boutique. The other employees watched in silence, some with pity, some with suspicion. The moment she stepped outside, a cool gust of autumn air hit her, but it did nothing to stop the heat burning in her face. She was being arrested for something she didn't do. The police station was cold, sterile, and suffocating. They questioned her for hours, asking the same thing over and over. "Did you take the bracelet? Are you in debt? Did someone put you up to this?" Each denial only seemed to make them more convinced she was lying. Finally, they let her go. No formal charges, yet. But that didn't matter. The damage had already been done. By the time she got home, her phone was flooded with messages. Friends, co-workers, even her landlord. She opened the first text. "What the hell, Rebecca? You really stole from Mrs. Ellsworth?" Her breath hitched. She scrolled down. "I hope it was worth it." "Guess we never really knew you." "You're fired. Come pick up your last check." Rebecca dropped the phone onto the couch and buried her face in her hands. Her job, her reputation, her life, all gone in a single day. And someone had set her up to take the fall. Now she just had to figure out who. Rebecca's life was a shattered puzzle. What was left of it, her apartment, her dignity, the few belongings she could salvage from her job, felt like the remnants of someone else's story. But Rebecca had always been resilient. She wouldn't let this be the end of her. She spent the first few nights in her apartment, eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, mind running on a loop. It wasn't just about clearing her name anymore. That was a pipe dream. No one would ever believe her, not after everything that had happened. No, what mattered now was making them pay. She started small. She combed through every detail of the boutique's security footage, rewatching the frames over and over, like a detective searching for a single clue. She didn't trust the security team at the store anymore. There was a leak somewhere. Her mind raced. Who had been in on it? Who had known she was the perfect scapegoat? The answer wasn't easy. It would take time, but she was patient. She kept to herself, making no waves. She'd learned to live below the radar, to blend in. The first step was rebuilding her life. And she did it quietly. Rebecca pulled up an old resume. She had a knack for design, for creating something from nothing. She'd worked with a small graphic design agency during college and still had a few freelance clients, but she knew that wasn't enough. She needed something more. The online courses were the first move. Hacking for beginners. She'd never imagined herself diving into that world, but now it felt like the perfect tool. By the end of the week, Rebecca could trace an IP address, navigate encrypted chat rooms, and extract sensitive information. It wasn't glamorous, but it was powerful. She used her newfound skills to dig into the boutique's accounts. There, buried in the corporate emails, was a name she didn't expect: Kara Lawson. Kara had been the manager's right hand, always trusted, always smiling. Rebecca's heart skipped a beat as she saw the email threads. Kara had been in contact with an outside source, a private investigator. They were all connected. Kara was the key, but Rebecca wasn't ready to confront her yet. She needed more. She reached out to her old friend, Lucas. He was a hacker, though they hadn't spoken in years. The lines between right and wrong had blurred for him a long time ago, but he owed her a favor from a messy situation during college. "Lucas, it's Rebecca." His voice on the other end was hesitant at first. "You're still alive?" "Barely," she said. "Listen, I need your help." He was skeptical, but the promise of cash convinced him. They met in a dimly lit coffee shop where Rebecca outlined her plan. Access Kara's private files, find out who was really behind the scheme, and, if possible, get leverage to expose them all. "Sounds like you've been busy," Lucas said, taking a drag from his cigarette. "You're not just looking to clear your name, are you?" Rebecca didn't answer. She didn't need to. Weeks passed as Rebecca and Lucas worked together in the shadows. She infiltrated Kara's social circles, pretending to be an interested client or a potential business partner. Each small interaction, each piece of information she gathered, brought her closer to the truth. Kara's dealings were more than shady. There were whispers about money laundering, tax evasion, and illegal imports. But it was one detail in Kara's personal emails that caught Rebecca's attention: a coded message between Kara and a mysterious figure she referred to only as A. Rebecca stared at the screen, heart pounding. A was the person who had orchestrated her downfall. Her patience was paying off. The pieces were falling into place. Then came her first small victory. Rebecca had been following Kara's routine for weeks, tracking her movements through social media, and it finally paid off. On a day when Kara was meeting with a supplier, Rebecca sneaked into her office under the guise of needing to drop off some documents. She knew Kara would be distracted. When she left, she'd slipped a flash drive into Kara's computer. The drive was loaded with an encrypted file, one that would give Rebecca the upper hand. The drive contained everything: photos of meetings, financial records, correspondence with A. Rebecca didn't need to act yet, not until the right moment. She smiled to herself. It was only a matter of time now. Rebecca's phone buzzed in her pocket just as she stepped out of the elevator onto the rooftop parking garage. Her heart raced with anticipation. Tonight was the night. She had orchestrated every move, every step. Kara's world was about to implode, and Rebecca would be there to watch it all come crashing down. She pulled her coat tighter against the evening chill and answered the call without looking at the screen. "Rebecca." Lucas's voice was strained, more urgent than usual. "You need to listen to me? And you need to listen now." Rebecca froze, her pulse suddenly pounding in her ears. "What is it?" It's not what you think. You're walking right into a trap. Her breath caught in her throat. What are you talking about? There's someone else, someone you haven't seen. I've been digging deeper into Kara's financials, and I found something big. She's not the mastermind here, Rebecca. She's a pawn in someone else's game. Rebecca's mind spun. This wasn't possible. She had spent months gathering intel, piecing together the puzzle. Kara was the one who had set her up. Kara was the one who had betrayed her. Who is it then? Who's pulling the strings? There was a long pause. Lucas's voice came through, barely above a whisper. It's your boss, Mrs. Ellsworth. Rebecca felt her stomach drop to the floor. No, that's impossible. She fired me. Lucas's tone was firm, unyielding. It wasn't her decision. She was just a figurehead. You were targeted from the beginning, Rebecca. Mrs. Ellsworth is deep in this mess, and she's been feeding Kara instructions the whole time. The store, everything, is part of a larger money laundering operation. Rebecca's hand trembled as she gripped the phone, her knees buckling. You're lying. I wish I was, Lucas said. I've got proof. Mrs. Ellsworth has been pulling the strings for months, even before you got involved. You were just a convenient scapegoat. Rebecca stood there, motionless, as the truth crashed over her like a tidal wave. Mrs. Ellsworth, the woman who had seemed so professional, so composed, the one who had built the boutique from the ground up. She was the one who had orchestrated everything, the theft, the framing, everything. But why? The sudden realization hit Rebecca like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just about revenge. This had always been about control. Mrs. Ellsworth had always seen Rebecca as a threat. She knew Rebecca had the potential to take over, to rise to the top. She had to be eliminated, framed, destroyed, and it had all been part of her plan. Rebecca's knees buckled as she sank to the cold concrete, the enormity of it sinking in. Kara had been a pawn, Mia an innocent bystander. But Mrs. Ellsworth, she was the mastermind. The plan had gone sideways, in the worst way. But that wasn't the worst part. Rebecca had made a critical mistake. In all her years working for Mrs. Ellsworth, she had trusted her. She had trusted that the woman who had mentored her, who had taught her the ropes of the boutique industry, was a true ally. She had bought into the illusion of loyalty. And now that loyalty had betrayed her. Suddenly, Rebecca felt the weight of the consequences. Everything she had done, the sabotage, the manipulation, the petty victories, had been for nothing. She was no longer fighting for justice. She was fighting for survival. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from an unknown number. "We know what you've been doing. Time's up." A chill ran through her veins as she looked around the parking garage, suddenly feeling exposed, vulnerable. She wasn't alone. She wasn't safe. The text was a threat. And if Mrs. Ellsworth had any part in it, that meant she was always 5 steps ahead. A new wave of panic gripped her chest as she realized how deep she had fallen into the trap, but Rebecca wasn't the kind to back down. No matter how much she had been played, she was going to make sure that someone paid. She grabbed the envelope she had stashed in her coat, a document with evidence that could expose the entire operation. She had one shot left, but as she turned to walk toward her car, a shadow stepped out from the darkness. Looking for something? Rebecca froze. The figure was tall, dressed in black, and their face was obscured by a mask. And in that moment, she knew her battle was far from over. It had only just begun. Rebecca's breath was sharp and shallow as the figure in the shadows stepped forward, the darkness hiding their face. She froze, but instinct kicked in, her fingers tightening around the envelope in her hand. She had to act. This was her last chance to expose everything, to make them all pay. "You're not alone anymore," the figure's voice rang out, smooth but cold. "Mrs. Ellsworth is expecting you." Rebecca's mind raced, but she didn't flinch. She had thought she'd been playing the game, outsmarting everyone. But the truth was, she'd been a pawn all along. This was the moment she could reclaim control, even if it meant going down fighting. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady but fierce. The figure stepped closer, their body language unreadable. You don't need to know, but you do need to understand. You've lost. A chill ran through her veins, and her hand instinctively reached for the phone in her pocket, her mind running through every escape route, every option she had. But before she could react, the sound of an approaching car engine cut through the tension. "Don't try to run," the figure warned, now mere steps away. The car screeched to a halt in front of the garage, and the figure turned their head briefly to glance at the vehicle. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest as the passenger door swung open. Out of the car stepped Kara. Her eyes were wild, her hair unkempt. But there was something more unsettling in her posture. Fear. "Kara?" Rebecca's voice wavered. Kara didn't answer right away. Her eyes darted to the figure standing next to Rebecca, then back to her. "You need to leave," she said, her tone quieter than usual, as if there was something off about this whole situation. "It's over. It's all over." Rebecca's head spun. Was Kara warning her? Was she on Rebecca's side, or was she just playing a part in this twisted game? The figure's voice sliced through the confusion. "Enough talking. She's made her choice." Rebecca's pulse thundered in her ears. She couldn't tell if she was in control anymore, or if she was the one being controlled. Before she could process what was happening, Kara reached into her coat pocket, pulling out a small device. Her fingers trembled as she held it up to the figure. "You said I'd be safe if I did this?" Kara whispered, her voice shaking. The figure didn't flinch. "You should have known better than to trust me." Rebecca's stomach twisted as she realized the truth. Kara was in on it. She had never been the victim she seemed to be. She was another player in this game, another piece to be sacrificed. But something inside Rebecca snapped. "What's happening?" Rebecca demanded. "Tell me the truth, Kara." For a moment, Kara hesitated. Her eyes were wide, like a trapped animal. Then she spoke in a voice so quiet, Rebecca almost didn't hear it. "It wasn't just about you. It was about us, Rebecca. We were both expendable. I was supposed to be the one to get close to you, get you to fall into their trap. And now? She took a shaky breath. "Now I'm just as stuck as you." Rebecca's mind reeled. This was bigger than she had ever imagined. Mrs. Ellsworth's betrayal was only the beginning. Kara was a player too. They were both tangled in a web they couldn't escape. And then, the twist. "But that doesn't matter now." The figure spoke again, stepping toward them with a cruel grin on their face. "You both think you can outplay me? You've been pawns in my game from the start." Rebecca's heart dropped into her stomach as the figure revealed themselves, their face hidden, but their voice familiar. It was Mrs. Ellsworth. The betrayal was complete. She had been watching them both, pulling the strings, and the game had never been about the boutique or money. It had been about power over them both. Rebecca's mind raced. Mrs. Ellsworth's cold smile chilled her to the bone. "You both believed in the illusion," Mrs. Ellsworth said, her voice dripping with satisfaction. "But I've always been the one in control. Every move you made was because I allowed it." Rebecca's chest tightened. All the months of planning, all the strategy, had led her here, straight into Mrs. Ellsworth's trap. But as her fingers tightened around the envelope in her hand, she realized something. She wasn't going to let it end like this. Not now. Not when she was so close. "I'm not giving up," Rebecca said, her voice low, firm. In one swift motion, she threw the envelope in the air, letting it fall to the ground. A flash of light caught her eye as the evidence inside scattered, flying in all directions, swirling around the room. Mrs. Ellsworth's smile faltered for a brief moment. That was all the opening Rebecca needed. As chaos erupted, Rebecca dove for the device Kara had been holding. A struggle ensued, and in a moment of desperation, Kara pushed Rebecca away. But in doing so, Kara lost her balance, and the device crashed to the ground, shattering in a flurry of sparks. Everything was falling apart. For a brief, fleeting moment, it seemed like they all might make it out. But as the sirens wailed in the distance, Rebecca knew that the fallout would be too massive to escape unscathed. Rebecca didn't win the battle, but in that moment, she realized something more important. She was free. Mrs. Ellsworth's empire crumbled. Her reign of control, manipulation, and deceit shattered before their eyes. But the cost was heavy. The life Rebecca had known was gone. The people she trusted, gone. The price of revenge had turned out to be far greater than she had ever imagined. But as the sirens grew louder, Rebecca felt a strange sense of peace. She had finally escaped the web of lies. Even if it meant losing everything, she had won something far more precious: her freedom. The once bustling boutique was now a shell of what it had been, its windows boarded up, its lights dim. Rebecca stood in front of the building, staring at the broken windows, the echoes of her past life reverberating in the empty space. The authorities had raided the operation just hours after the showdown, seizing files, equipment, and evidence that linked Mrs. Ellsworth to a series of high-stakes crimes. The police had arrested her, Kara, and others who had been involved in the scheme. But that wasn't the end. The media had caught wind of the story, and the scandal spread like wildfire. But the truth of Rebecca's role in it all had been buried beneath the noise, overshadowed by the crimes of those higher up. She had played a key part in bringing the operation to light, but she'd also been left with the haunting question: was it worth it? Weeks passed since the dust settled. Rebecca sat at a small cafe, her hands wrapped around a mug of lukewarm coffee, her gaze lost in the steam rising from the surface. The world had gone on, but for her, nothing had felt the same. She had taken down the empire, exposed the lies, watched as the pieces of her life fell into place. She had gotten what she wanted, and yet, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like an empty win, a hollow echo of the revenge she had longed for. The satisfaction she had once imagined, the feeling of triumph, the rush of justice, never came. Instead, there was a gnawing emptiness inside her, a realization that even when the enemy is defeated, the battle never truly ends. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a text from Lucas. "You did it. But how are you really doing?" She stared at the message for a long time, her fingers hovering over the keys. How was she really doing? Her fingers slowly typed a response. "I did what I had to do, but now I'm just trying to figure out what comes next." She set the phone down and looked out the window. The city was alive, its rhythm steady and relentless, but Rebecca felt out of sync, like she was drifting just outside the current of life. Her eyes caught a reflection of herself in the cafe window, a woman who had once been full of hope, full of ambition, now standing on the other side of her own choices. She wondered if she would ever feel whole again, if she would ever be able to see herself the way she used to. The truth was, Rebecca had won her revenge, but at what cost? The people she had trusted, the relationships she had built, all lay in ruins. She had gained her freedom, but the victory felt empty because she had lost so much along the way. She picked up her cup, took a sip, and let the warmth spread through her, trying to push away the coldness that had settled deep within her heart. The city outside continued its pulse, unaware of the quiet storm that raged inside her. As she stood to leave, she caught a glimpse of her reflection once more. Her eyes were hard, a mask of steel formed from the sharp edges of the past. But beneath the surface there was still a flicker of doubt, a flicker that whispered, "Was it worth it?" Rebecca walked out of the cafe, her footsteps echoing on the pavement, but the question lingered in the air, unanswered. The price of vengeance was high, and though she had emerged victorious, she couldn't shake the feeling that something essential had been lost in the process. The final twist of revenge wasn't a moment of triumph. It was the hollow realization that vengeance can only offer fleeting satisfaction, never the peace she had hoped for. And as she disappeared into the crowd, the haunting question followed her: what now?